I'm on social media a little bit, and one of the things that I have is an Instagram account. And I'll let you know right off the bat that if you follow me on Instagram, you're going to be sorely disappointed because I never post anything. But I've discovered that there's a little game that gets played on Instagram. For example, I like barbecue. I don't eat a lot of meat, but when I do, I love barbecue. So one of the things that I do is I actually follow a few of my favorite barbecue restaurants throughout the nation. I follow Evie Mae's and the Salt Lick and the Polite Pig, Joe's Kansas City. But I noticed something that after I started following a few barbecue restaurants, I started getting follow requests. You know, the such and such would like to follow you. And I started to get more barbecue restaurants and smoker companies and barbecue stores that sell all things barbecue. So here's how this game kind of works. They know that everybody loves that little dopamine drop when we have that notification on social media. They also know that we're inclined to accept a follow request, but here's the game. If I follow you, you have to follow me. And so what we have done is we've kind of created this system that if you want to be followed, you have to follow in return. And here's one of the challenges that I kind of find with social media and the whole idea of follow. It's that we've adopted a really low bar when it comes to the idea of following. The bar is so low that the only thing required of us is the click of a mouse or the press of a screen. And so when Jesus says something like, follow me, and we read that in the Bible, we know that it involves more than the click of a mouse or the press of a screen. But we also realize that there is this whole cultural difference, that there's our culture in what it means to follow, and it's Jesus' culture and what it meant to follow. And those are polar opposites in many regards. However, when we hear follow me, we begin to kind of grapple with what does that mean? So we're going to work to that today. We're going to work to the idea of what it really meant when Jesus said, follow me. But before we get there here today, I want to just kind of recap a couple of items that we discussed last week and really kind of bring up a couple of ideas. You know, we're beginning our message journey through the book of Mark. And as we are journeying through Mark, one of the things that he does kind of right off the bat as he tells the life story of Jesus' ministry, one of the things that he does is he begins kind of with a thinly veiled statement of Jesus is greater than. Jesus is greater than everything, but ultimately Jesus is greater than Caesar. And again, he lays out some cultural perspectives for Romans to understand that Jesus is the arriving, conquering king. And he even makes the statement of, I'm not even worthy to untie his shoes. You see, that was the most menial task that any servant could possibly have. And John is saying, Jesus is so great, I'm not even worthy to do the most menial thing for him. But not only is Jesus greater than, he is different than. Let me ask a couple of questions. Just kind of ponder these, if you will. But if you're the Lord of creation and you're making your arrival here on this earth, how would you arrive? Most of us would not choose a barn for our place of birth. We wouldn't have chosen Bethlehem. And if you've spent hundreds of years orchestrating your arrival, your kind of announcement, ushering in that this is my first public appearance, where would you make that appearance? I think most of us, if we can be honest with ourselves, we probably would say, well, it would have been Rome or Athens or even the temple in Jerusalem. We would not have chosen a muddy river out in the middle of nowhere. And if we're getting ready to begin our official rule and reign here on this earth, and we're beginning that official time of ministry, again, where would we choose? Rome, Athens, Jerusalem? Jesus chose Galilee. There's nothing wrong with Galilee. It's just not the epicenter of thought or religion or government or military might or anything like that. In fact, it was just a normal area that no one really kind of gave a second thought. In many ways, Galilee is what we oftentimes call Middle America. It was flyover. Wasn't necessarily a place that you wanted to go. You went through it because you had to, but it wasn't necessarily a place that you would stay. So one more question. If you're getting ready to assemble your team to begin your rule and reign here on this earth, who do you choose? What kind of team do you assemble? I'm thinking, do you look for the greatest minds? Do you look for military giants? Do you look for influential leaders? You see, as we get into kind of the beginning of Jesus' ministry, one of the things that he does is he begins to assemble his team. And again, he continues that path of different than. His team is different than any other team that any other king would assemble. And that's going to be found in Mark chapter 1. We're going to start with verse 16 here today. And this is what it says. One day, Jesus was walking along the shore of the Sea of Galilee. He saw Simon and his brother Andrew throwing a net into the water, for they fished for a living. And Jesus called out to them, and I assume called out fairly loudly since he was on the shore and they were in a boat. Come, follow me, and I will show you how to fish for people. And they left their nets at once and followed him. One of the big words or phrases that we're going to find a lot in the book of Mark is at once and suddenly. That's this gospel of movement and action. And it goes on to say a little farther up the shore, Jesus saw Zebedee's sons, James and John, in a boat repairing their nets. He called them at once, and they also followed him, leaving their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired men. So before we discuss the whole idea and notion of follow, let's consider those that Jesus picked first to follow him. Going back to verse 16, again, we read, one day as Jesus was walking along the shore of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew throwing a net into the water, for they fished for a living. And the same thing in verse 19, a little farther up the shore, Jesus saw Zebedee's sons, James and John, in a boat repairing their nets. These guys were blue collar. These guys were just your average Joe Schmo. And when you think about this, the first people Jesus called to follow him were extraordinarily ordinary. They weren't military giants. They weren't great thinkers. They weren't well educated. They weren't influential leaders. They were normal. You know, Peter gets a little bit more press, or Simon gets a little bit more press than Andrew does. But one of the things, when you look at Peter, Scripture honestly portrays him as thick-headed and incredibly imperfect. I mean, he's always putting his foot in his mouth. It was that one time that Jesus actually had to say to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan," because Peter just didn't get it, and even up to the point of denying Jesus when Jesus was about to go to the cross. And James and John, Jesus gave them the name sons of thunder. Evidently, their father might have been a hothead, but the reality is, like father, like son. There's a time in Luke chapter 8 where there was a Samaritan village that didn't welcome Jesus. And so James and John come up to Jesus and they were like, "So, you want us to call fire down from heaven?" In other words, These people need to be judged. They were ready to be the executioner for Jesus. And then there's Mama. Mama goes to Jesus and says, how about we work this out? How about my boys sit next to you at your right and your left as you reign in your kingdom? These were incredibly imperfect people, but I love this. I love this because one of the things that I learned is you don't have to be awesome to follow Jesus. You don't have to be a great religious mind. You don't have to be an influential leader. You don't have to have incredible abilities. You just need to follow Jesus. In fact, I love what it says in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 26. Paul is talking to the church, and he says, "Remember, dear brothers and sisters, that few of you were wise in the world's eyes or powerful or wealthy when God called you." In fact, when we're not great, it means it's easier to put the spotlight on Jesus. And notice what Jesus says to both Peter and Andrew and James and John. He just simply says, "Follow me." And notice he doesn't say, "Read my book." Notice he doesn't say, get my blog in your email every Monday morning. He doesn't say, "Take my new course" or "Try my new spiritual plan." No, he says, "Follow me." And unfortunately, social media has drained the idea of follow to the point that we can be casual observers. We can be casual observers, and we can do this from a distance with zero investment from ourselves. But even in the church, we've kind of drained follow me into follow me is to attend. Follow me is to make an appearance. Follow me is to adhere to a couple of rules or participate in church or even practice Christianity. And that's not necessarily something that Jesus has called us to. He has called us to follow. So a little bit about the ancient world. When a rabbi would come by and see a person and say, "Follow me," that was a great honor. It was a great honor to know that a rabbi had noticed you. And so basically, we understand that there's a great thing. And it was maybe easy for them to answer this call, but with the follow me and the honor also came really high expectations. And I think that's one of the things that we sometimes miss is that high expectation that we don't really get with the idea of follow in our culture today. You see, a rabbi or a teacher expected radical attachment, unfailing allegiance, and unwavering loyalty. It ultimately meant that you're giving up everything at this moment in your life to walk with that individual. And so it was true then, and I think it's even true now. And that high expectation level that Jesus had as a rabbi, I think that's why when people came up and said, "I want to follow you," oftentimes he might object to that because he knew that they weren't willing to live up to the expectation that he had as a teacher with students, teacher with followers. So let me just share a few thoughts about what it means to follow. I'm going to have several statements, and these statements really all begin with when I follow Jesus. And so one of the things that I understand is that when I follow Jesus, I surrender. I think one of the things that we find beginning to happen here, in fact, it says that James and John, they left their boat, they left their livelihood, they left their family. When I follow Jesus, I surrender. I surrender my will, and I surrender my time, and I surrender my comfort and my finances and my agenda and my free time. I surrender, and this is probably the biggest thing for us to do in our world today because it has become such an idol. I surrender my politics. And so basically, when I follow Jesus, I surrender everything. Heck, it's almost as though when I say I follow Jesus, I put everything on the table, and then it's as if as I lay everything on the table, I don't get to determine what I keep. I don't get to determine what's thrown away. I don't get to determine the agenda. That everything that is on the table is completely up to Jesus and his agenda. Now, as we're talking about surrender here today, I want to add something else to this. When I surrender to Jesus, or when I follow Jesus, I surrender my identity. One of the biggest things that we worship in our culture today is our identity. Identity comes in so many different forms, and people cling to that identity. But here's the reality: whether it be race, whether it be religion, whether it be our political affiliation, or even sexual orientation, the idea here is we say, no, this is who I am. But when I follow Jesus, I surrender my identity to him. I no longer get to choose and say, this is who I am. He gets to say, this is who you are. And in fact, it says in Corinthians that if anyone is in Christ, they are a new creation. In other words, Jesus determines our value. Jesus determines our identity, and our identity is ultimately connected to him. And so he gets to say, this is who you are. But here's the beautiful picture. Baggage is gone. Old identity is gone. Ideas that people have imposed upon you in your past, those things are gone. What matters is the identity that you have in following Jesus and being attached to him, to his name, to his life, to his death and his burial and his resurrection. That's where our identity is found. So I surrender my identity so that I can take on his. Also, when I follow Jesus, I do what he says. I know that we live in a world that says, you do you. You follow your own path. You do what feels good or what you think is right. But Jesus, actually, right before he went to the cross, he said these words to those followers. There were more by the time Jesus went to the cross, but those 4 that he initially followed were right there. If you love me, obey my commandments. If you call on me, if you've attached yourself to me, if you identify with me, then the expectation is you're going to do what I say. No more you doing you. It is you following me, obeying what I have told you to do. Also, when I follow Jesus, I live as he lived. Peter was really one of the first 2 people called by Jesus to follow him. Several decades after Jesus was resurrected and went back up into heaven to be with God, Peter wrote the early church to give them some instructions. And he actually wrote 2 letters, 1 Peter and 2 Peter. But in 1 Peter chapter 2, this is something he says. For God called you to do good, even if it means suffering. And just as Christ suffered for you, he is your example, and you must follow in his steps. I love that statement. He's your example, and you must follow in his steps. Part of what it means to follow Jesus is to model our life after him, to get to know him so well that we begin to look like him, we begin to act like him. Ultimately, our goal should be is that people never see us, but always see Jesus. And also here today, when I follow Jesus, I live with a new purpose. In verse 17, this is what what we find. It says, Jesus called out to them, "Come, follow me, and I will show you how to fish for people." It's interesting that Jesus was able to make the connection with them gathering fish to what it means for them to follow him and ultimately gather people. And so he was calling them out of one life and into another. Old life, they fished for fish, and while that's noble and all, it's not fishing for people. So they got to be in the business of helping rescue people from eternal damnation, getting to rescue people from hell, getting to rescue people from the judgment and the wrath of God. He says, so now when you follow me, you have a new purpose for your life. It's not just making a little bit of money. It's not just eking by. It's changing eternities, one life at a time. So I've rattled off quite a bit here today, but I want to kind of put it in one succinct statement here today, and this is going to be our bottom line. It's this right here. To follow is to radically connect and align my life to Jesus' life, his way of life, and ultimately his agenda. In other words, I don't get to say, Jesus, I want to make you into my image, into my likeness. I want you to conform to my life. When I follow, I ultimately say everything is on the table to be conformed to the life and the way of life and the agenda of Jesus. So 10 years ago, a pastor in Kentucky, his name is Kyle Idleman. Idleman wrote a book called Not a Fan. And the premise of the book is Jesus isn't interested in having fans. And fans are great and all, but fans wear T-shirts and hats and sweatshirts and wear foam fingers at games, and they cheer on their team. Fans ultimately are not active participants in anything that is going on other than they may be religiously loyal, but at best, they are passionate observers of what is really going on. And so Jesus isn't really concerned about having passionate observers or people sitting on the sidelines watching everything happen. Instead, Jesus, as he called his first followers, did this. He called people off of the sidelines and into the game to be active participants in his life and his ministry and his agenda. I fear that oftentimes, whether it be watching online or being present in church, sometimes we're more passionate observers. Sometimes we fit more the category of fan than follower. But I'm going to ask you a question here today, and it's just one question, this one idea of how to own the message here. And it's this: are you a fan or a follower? Are you a fan or a follower? Are you a casual observer to everything that is going on in the kingdom? Or have you rolled up your sleeves and decided to be an active participant in Jesus' life and his way of life and his agenda? You know, one of the beautiful things I love about the book of Mark is that it's always moving, it's always going somewhere. And so as Jesus called his first followers, he really doesn't waste any time. And you see, immediately after this, Jesus goes in, and he's actually at the synagogue, and synagogue would be like Jewish church. So it's a Sabbath day, and everyone is gathered, and it says that Jesus at the synagogue began to teach. And people were absolutely floored because as he began to teach, he taught as one who had authority. But not only that, there in attendance that day. There was a man who was at the synagogue, and it says that he had an unclean spirit, or he had an evil spirit living inside of him. And it actually goes on to say that man that had the evil spirit inside of him. And I always picture, when I read this, I think of Venom in the Spider-Man movie, because the man kind of goes, Jesus of Nazareth, what do you want with us? Have you come here to destroy us? And as that is happening, Jesus said these words, "Be quiet, come out." And as soon as he said those words, "Be quiet, come out of the man," it said that the man shook violently. He convulsed, and the evil spirits left him. And people were amazed. People were amazed at not only that Jesus spoke with authority, but that he had authority. And he had not just authority over man, he had authority over the spiritual realm as well. I think in many ways Jesus needed to show his first followers, listen, I've called you out. I've called you into a different life. But I want to let you know, you've signed up for something incredible. My agenda is unlike any other agenda ever known to man. And so when you say, I follow Jesus, it's not clicking a mouse. It's not pressing a screen. It's really not even about attendance or participation or practicing Christianity. It's about aligning your life to an agenda and a person unlike any other. Join me in prayer. Father, thank you. Thank you so much for being able to know that you have called us out of the humdrum, mundane of life into an agenda unlike any other agenda known to man. And to a person, not to a religion, but to a person that we can follow, that we can look to, that we can walk in his steps and ultimately live as he lived and be about the same business as he was about. And that is rescuing people from hell, rescuing people from your wrath. So may we not just be casual observers, watching from a distance with zero investment. May we truly be all in for Jesus. Thank you. In his name, amen.